The villagers had never seen an elephant cry. It happened on the morning of Elio Varma's funeral. The day fog clung low over the hills, muffling every sound but the slow rhythm of mourning drums. The procession had moved silently toward the temple ruins, where the forest opened into a clearing thick with dew. People walked barefoot. Men held incense, women carried marigolds, and a boy held a small photo of Elio pressed against his chest. No one expected what came next. The fog shifted as if pushed by an invisible breath. A deep vibration pulsed through the earth. Heads turned, birds scattered from the treetops. And then he appeared. From the shadows of the tree line, an elephant emerged. Massive, weathered, deliberate. He walked alone. No herds followed. No mahout guided him. His tusks were long and chipped, his ears ragged from time. But his presence was impossible to look away from. He moved with gravity, each step heavy with memory. The villagers froze. Children clutched their mothers. Elders whispered prayers. The priest's voice faltered. This wasn't an elephant from a nearby reserve. This one came from deeper lands. The forest no one entered, where no maps dared stretch. But the elephant did not charge. He did not hesitate. He walked directly to the altar, where Elio's simple casket lay beneath a blanket of sandalwood and flowers. And then, as if pulled by grief older than words, he bent one leg and slowly lowered himself beside the body. Not collapsing, kneeling. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped their incense. Someone else began to weep. The elephant did not move. He didn't trumpet, didn't swing his trunk in rage. He rested his broad forehead against the earth, inches from the edge of the casket, and simply stayed, mourning. The priest stepped back, overwhelmed. He looked at the villagers, then at the elephant, then at the sky, as if asking for permission to continue. No one spoke, and in that silence all anyone could hear was the faintest sound of breath, not from the people, from the elephant, long, slow, trembling. He was crying. Tears tracked down the grooves of his ancient skin, mixing with the dust of the ground where Elio would soon return. They did not know this elephant, but Elio had, and the forest remembered. Years before, long before any of the villagers knew what grief looked like on four legs, Elio Varma had walked these same trails as a stranger, a man who spoke little, a man who never smiled. He had arrived in the village after dusk on a stormy day, soaked through, carrying only a duffel and a box of medical journals. His hair was more gray than black then, but his hands were steady, his eyes sharp. Some said he had been a doctor, others said he was hiding, but no one asked directly. He built a home on the edge of the forest, close to the wild, not on the main road, not near the school. He planted herbs in silence, read under a neem tree, and spoke only when spoken to. And though the villagers offered kindness, chai, warm meals, invitations to weddings, Elio always smiled softly and declined. It wasn't unkindness, it was distance, and distance, they would later understand, came from grief, because Elio had once had a daughter and a wife, and the sea had taken them both, in a monsoon that twisted a ferry-like paper. Elio had been on the shore, waiting for their return. He never saw them again, and after the sea gave him no answers, he turned to the forest. One day, a scream split the valley, not human, but filled with pain. The villagers stayed indoors. Even the dogs howled, but Elio followed the sound, deep into the trees, through thorn and moss and silence. He moved like he had nothing left to lose, and what he found changed everything. The forest had always held its secrets, but that day it screamed. Elio had been tending to his turmeric roots, his sleeves rolled up, when the cry shattered the afternoon stillness, a deep, rattling bellow that didn't echo, but sank straight into the marrow of his bones. It was no ordinary elephant call. It was pain, raw, wounded, alive. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed only a scarf, a pouch of herbal salves, and his walking staff, then stepped into the trees as if drawn by something older than instinct, something ancestral. The kind of pull that doesn't come from the ears, but from the heart. The forest thickened quickly. Vines reached like fingers. Roots clawed up from the soil. Birds fell silent. But Elio moved with purpose, barefoot, letting the earth guide him. He walked for over an hour, and then he found him. Kavi, or rather, the elephant that would one day be called Kavi. At the bottom of a shallow ravine, crumpled beside a shattered fig tree, lay a juvenile elephant, no more than 7 or 8 years old, alone, trembling, and barely breathing. His flank had been pierced by something cruel, a metal hook, rusted and jagged, buried deep into his shoulder. Blood had soaked the ground beneath him. Flies swarmed like a cloud. Elio froze. The smell of iron and infection hit him like a wave. But more than the injury, it was the look in the elephant's eye that shattered him. Terror and exhaustion, and the unmistakable gaze of something waiting to die. Elio's knees gave slightly, because he knew that look. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror for months after the ocean took his family. That slow descent into numbness, that quiet plea to not be woken again. He took a step closer. The elephant flinched, but he didn't run. He couldn't. His leg was twisted beneath him, swollen, likely fractured, and the hook. Elio knew enough about wounds to see that it had been deliberate, no accident. Someone had meant to hurt this animal. Maybe poachers, maybe worse. Elio exhaled. He sank slowly to his knees, letting his bag fall beside him. Not a word spoken, no reaching hand, just presence. The elephant stared. For minutes, or hours, time blurred. The two stayed like that, one grieving in silence, the other dying in it. Finally, Elio moved. He untied the scarf from his neck and dipped it in water from a nearby spring. Inch by inch, he crept forward, his movements slow as breath. When he reached the elephant's side, he didn't touch him. He simply laid the damp cloth on a rock and waited. Another hour passed, and then, without looking, the elephant nudged the cloth toward himself. Elio didn't cry often, but that day, he did. He returned every day, with herbs, with food, with water. He read aloud as he cleaned the wound, not knowing if the sound helped, but needing to hear something other than silence. He sat in the rain. He built a shelter from leaves. And when the elephant screamed from pain during healing, Elio whispered songs he barely remembered from childhood. They were both healing something neither could name. Weeks passed, and the elephant stood, wobbly at first, but stronger. His eyes had changed. Not from wild to tame, Elio would never tame a creature like this, but from fear to recognition, to presence. That's when Elio gave him a name, Kavi. It meant poet in Sanskrit, because even in pain, there was something poetic in the way the elephant moved, in the way he paused by the river, in the way he watched the world as if seeing what others missed. And somehow, the boy who had once been left behind by the ocean began to come back to life. Soon, Kavi would vanish back into the forest. Elio would see him only from time to time, a shadow in the mist, a thump of footsteps near the cabin, a flash of tusks through trees. But each time, Kavi paused, looked, acknowledged, and then disappeared again, until the day of the funeral. The years folded themselves gently, and in that quiet corner of the hills, 2 lives, one human, one wild, grew around each other like the roots of old trees, never tangled, never forced, just present. Side by side, Kavi never stayed for long. He was a creature of the wild, after all. The forest had raised him long before Elio arrived, and Elio had no desire to keep what was never his. But something had shifted between them, and once a season, sometimes more, the great elephant returned, always unannounced, always at dusk, and Elio knew, without fail, when he was coming, not by sound, but by stillness. The birds would hush, the bees would scatter, the wind would change, and the forest would grow so quiet that even Elio's breath felt too loud. Then, like a memory stepping into form, Kavi would appear, towering, silent, watching. He never came close enough to touch. Elio never tried. Instead, he would sit on the old stone by the well, hands in his lap, eyes forward, and nod. Just once. Kavi would nod back, and they would sit like that, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, until the stars blinked open above them. People in the nearby village began to whisper. They called Elio the one the elephant visits. Children would wander near the edge of the forest, hoping to catch a glimpse. Some villagers believed Elio was cursed. Others said he had been chosen by the spirits, but none dared go too deep. There was something sacred in that part of the forest, something they felt but could not name. Elio didn't care for stories. He didn't even care to explain. The boy who had once drowned in grief now found himself held together by the rhythm of the forest, the honey of his hives, and the silence of a creature that had become part of his soul. He still grieved. Grief, after all, never truly leaves. It just learns to walk beside you. But Kavi had given his sorrow shape, something to anchor to, and in return Elio had given the elephant something rare for a wild creature: consistency, trust, a safe place in a world that so often punishes tenderness. The last time Elio saw him was 2 weeks before the end. It had rained all morning, and the clouds still clung to the hills like wet cotton. Elio had been gathering fallen branches near the river when he felt it, the quiet shift. He turned, and there he was, Kavi, older now, his tusks stronger, curved like the crescent moon, his skin darker with mud and weather, but those eyes, still deep, still aware. Elio stepped back instinctively, giving him space, but this time, something changed. Kavi moved closer, one step, then another. Elio froze. It had been years. All that time, never once had Kavi crossed the invisible line between them, but now he did. And then the elephant knelt. It wasn't a full collapse, not like that first time. This was intentional, gentle, reverent. Kavi lowered his head until his trunk touched the earth, just inches from Elio's feet. And for the first time in all their years, Elio reached out. His fingers trembled as they met the rough skin. Warm, alive, real. Kavi didn't flinch. He simply stayed. And Elio did too, until the stars returned again. He never told anyone, not the villagers, not even the boy who brought him honey jars from town. But in his journal that night, Elio wrote just one line. He came to say goodbye. He didn't know what it meant, not yet. But something inside him ached in a way that felt different from the old grief. A premonition, perhaps. Or maybe just a quiet knowing that time, even shared between soul-bound beings, eventually asks to move forward. The next morning, Elio coughed. By nightfall, he couldn't stand. By the end of the week, he was gone. And the forest fell silent in a way it hadn't in years. But that was not the end of the story. Because on the morning of Elio's funeral, something happened that would be whispered for generations. And no one, not even those who had doubted the stories, could explain what they saw next. It began with a quiet sunrise. Mist clung low to the valley, and dew beaded across the tall grass like tiny shards of glass. The villagers gathered in silence, a small procession winding up the hill behind the chapel ruins. Elio had asked for no service, no prayers, just the forest. But they came anyway, not out of duty, but reverence. The man who had lived half invisible among them had somehow woven himself into the fabric of their stories. The one who healed bees with smoke and leaves. The one who never raised his voice. The one who sat with grief as if it were a friend and turned sorrow into honey. And yes, the one the elephant visited. They wrapped him in linen and wildflowers, just as he had once requested. There was no casket, no polished wood. Only a body, prepared gently, and placed beneath the almond tree he had planted when he first arrived. It was the boy from town, Matteo, who noticed it first. As the final shovel of earth covered the grave, a sound rose behind them. Not a roar, not a trumpet, but the unmistakable pressure of the earth moving, of something vast, drawing breath. Heads turned. From beyond the tree line, through the haze of morning fog, a shape emerged. At first it was only a silhouette, a shadow, too large to be believed. Some gasped, others stepped back. Matteo dropped the lantern in his hand, then it broke through the mist. Kavi, the elephant, alone, unaccompanied, unannounced. His head bowed low, his pace slow, almost limping. Not with pain, but with sorrow. He crossed the space between the trees and the grave in silence, his massive feet barely disturbing the grass. And then he stopped, right in front of them, right where Elio lay. No one spoke. No one dared move. Kavi looked at the mound of fresh earth, his body trembling. Then, with deliberate care, he bent his knees and folded. The forest held its breath. He knelt beside the grave, not like an animal, but like a mourner. His trunk extended forward, and gently, with impossible precision, he touched the soil. Once, twice, and then he placed a stone, a single, round, river-worn stone, small enough to carry in his trunk, heavy enough to mean something. No one knew where he had gotten it. No one knew how long he had carried it. But in that moment, it felt older than grief itself, as if this was a ritual older than language. Kavi remained there for hours, not moving, not eating, not calling out. He simply knelt beside the man who had once sat with him in silence and offered him the same. He didn't need to understand death the way humans did. He didn't need to know the name written on the wooden marker or why people cried. He knew only this: someone he had loved had gone still, and the forest had changed. The bees didn't buzz that day. Even the wind seemed to pause. When evening finally fell, and the villagers had all quietly left, Kavi stood. He turned back toward the forest. But before he disappeared, he did one last thing. He raised his trunk, high, and let out a sound that hadn't been heard in years. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild. It was a sound full of space, of gratitude, of goodbye. And then he vanished into the trees. For weeks after, the stone remained where he had placed it, and no one dared touch it, not even Matteo, who returned every few days with fresh wildflowers. The boy would sit by the grave, legs crossed, telling stories of the elephant and the beekeeper, even if no one was there to listen, because deep down, he believed something still was, and he wasn't wrong. In the days that followed, the villagers began to speak of Elio and Kavi as one name, never separate. Elio and the elephant, a story, a rhythm, a quiet reminder. Children left leaves and wildflowers by the grave, mimicking Kavi's stone. Old women whispered blessings when passing under the almond tree. Even those who once feared the forest now paused, heads bowed, near the bend in the river where Kavi had been seen watching the sun set. No one had seen him again, but they knew he was there. There were footprints, sometimes, large, sunken impressions left near the chapel ruins or beside the apiary, always at night, always alone. Matteo, the boy who had dropped his lantern, returned daily. He no longer carried fear in his eyes, only awe. He started tending the hives Elio had once cared for, not because he was told to, but because it felt right. He read the old journals Elio had left behind, written in crooked handwriting, notes about bees and grief and the space between. He read them aloud, sitting cross-legged beneath the almond tree, and sometimes he swore the wind turned warm, just for a second. One morning, a woman from the next village came, carrying a bruised sparrow in her hands. She had heard of the grave, of the elephant, of the man who had once healed things without words. She sat by the grave and cried quietly, the bird cupped in her palms. The next day, others followed. A child with a broken leg, a grandfather with a crushed heart, a woman whose daughter had vanished across the sea. They didn't come for miracles. They came because something about that place, that grave, that stone, that elephant, felt safe, felt real. Then the bees came back, not just to the hives Matteo tended, but to the valley. In swarms of gold and shimmer, they returned to the flowers that had once been left untouched. They built new combs in the hollow trees. They circled the chapel ruins, and the villagers began to say, Elio is still here, but the one who changed most was Matteo. Under the soft hum of bees and the heavy silence of the woods, he grew not older, but deeper. He began writing in Elio's notebook, just as the old man had. Not facts, but feelings. Not lists, but memories. He wrote of the elephant, of the stone, of the way the earth had seemed to pause that day. He wrote, not to remember, but to understand. Because some part of him had begun to see. Kavi had not just mourned. He had taught them how to sit with sorrow, how to kneel when there are no words, how to leave behind something small and sacred when you can't stay. And then, one night, weeks after the funeral, Matteo woke to a sound, soft, distant, familiar. He slipped from his bed, feet bare on the cool floor, and followed the moonlight out to the hill. And there, under the almond tree, beside the grave, stood Kavi, not bowed, not grieving, still, at peace. The boy didn't speak. He only walked forward and sat beside him. The elephant didn't move except to glance once, slow and steady, as if recognizing something in the boy's face. And in that moment, Matteo knew. This was not the end of Elio's story. It was its beginning. They sat together for a long time, boy and beast, under the silver hush of the stars. Matteo didn't speak. He didn't move. His breath rose like smoke into the night air, and beside him, Kavi's chest lifted in deep, steady rhythm, slower than sleep, older than silence. The earth didn't ask for words that night. It asked only presence, and Matteo understood. He was there to witness. When the breeze shifted, Kavi stood, slowly, as if every movement was deliberate, as if the moment itself had weight. He turned toward the almond tree. The blossoms had not yet returned, not since the funeral, but something had changed. The branches no longer felt empty. They felt waiting. Kavi moved toward the base of the tree and pressed his forehead to its bark, just once. A gentle nudge. Then, with surprising grace, he lifted his trunk and laid something at the base. A piece of cloth, soft, weathered, stained with earth and sap. Matteo recognized it immediately. The scarf Elio had always worn around his neck, the one Kavi had taken the day of the funeral, the one he had kept, held, carried. Now he left it behind. Matteo's chest tightened. His throat burned. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a language. The elephant was giving back what could not be buried. Love. Then Kavi turned, and he did something that no one expected. He knelt, not from pain, not from exhaustion, from reverence. He bowed before the grave, his massive head low, his eyes closed. And in that stillness, the night changed. A wind rose, not cold but soft, scented with jasmine and honey. The valley seemed to exhale. Matteo felt his skin prickle, but not from fear, from knowing, from being allowed to see something sacred, something the forest had carried long before he was born. And in that bow, that silence, that final act, Kavi became more than an elephant. He became a symbol of memory, of loyalty, of a love that needed no words. He rose without sound and turned toward the forest. Matteo stood, eyes stinging. He wanted to follow, but didn't. He knew the goodbye had already been said. Kavi vanished into the trees, his shape swallowed by shadow. And Matteo stayed, alone but not abandoned, changed. The next day the scarf remained where it had been placed. Matteo didn't touch it. He built a small altar around it, simple stones, a bowl of honey, a circle of white flowers from the hills. The villagers came and added their own pieces, a carved bead, a feather, a note written in shaking hands. It became a new place of mourning, but also of healing. A week later, Matteo began to teach, not in a school, but in the forest. He guided children through the trails Elio once walked, taught them the names of flowers, the rhythm of bees, the art of stillness. He read from Elio's notebook under the almond tree, now beginning to bloom again, not all at once, but petal by petal. Life was returning, not the same, but deeper, wiser, more silent, more sacred. And though Kavi was never seen again, sometimes at dusk, the wind carried a sound that wasn't quite birdsong, a low rumble, almost like thunder, except it calmed the heart instead of startling it. Matteo would pause when he heard it. He would smile and whisper, not to the sky, but to the ground beneath his feet, "Thank you." Years passed, and the village changed. Children who once followed Matteo through the trails now led others, their voices quiet but confident, their hands gentle, their hearts soft from having learned that love doesn't always arrive with sound. They spoke of Elio in stories that no longer bled, of the elephant who had loved him, of a valley that remembered. But over time, even the sharpest memories soften. Names become echoes. Only the feeling remains. One summer, a young woman arrived in the valley, a conservationist from the capital. She had heard the old stories and dismissed them as folklore, but she stayed for a week. And on her final day, just as the sun began to lower and the hills turned golden, she paused by the old almond tree. It was in full bloom, white petals spilled like snow. She tilted her head. At the base of the tree, protected beneath a dome of dried leaves, she found something strange. A stone, carved. It wasn't old, not ancient, but worn with care, and etched onto it in simple, careful lines was the shape of an elephant's eye, closed, at peace. She asked no questions. She took no photos. She left a single feather at the base and walked away. Sometimes, truth lives quietly. In the mountains, no one speaks the elephant's name anymore. But when storms pass and the skies clear, and the trees glisten from rain, villagers say the air smells like honey. That's when Mateo's grandchildren look up and listen, and if they're very still, they sometimes hear a distant rumble, soft, steady, almost like a voice saying, "I'm still here." Love, real love, is not loud. It's not always easy to explain. It shows up in the silence, in the waiting, in the eyes of those who choose to stay even after the world forgets. Kavi did not speak, but he remembered. He returned. He bowed. And in that simple act, more powerful than any monument, he taught everyone what it means to grieve with grace, to thank the ones who saw us, to leave behind something sacred. And if you've ever felt that someone left too soon, if you've ever wondered whether love outlives the body, then look to the earth, look to the trail, look to the trees that bloom, quietly, even after long winters. Somewhere, something remembers, and maybe that's enough. He didn't bring flowers. He brought something louder than words, memory.